Good morning. So here is episode 1 of Mr. Andrews, the miniseries. Listen, you guys, y'all saw me earlier when I did that video. So I'm finally settled, and it's 1:24 a.m. I just looked at the clock on my TV. I decided I would probably do my filming late at night because I won't have to worry about interruptions of my phone ringing, cutting me off or anything like that. So I decided, let me just go on and do this first episode tonight, and it will be posted later today by this afternoon or whenever I wake up, because it's 1:24. I'll try to keep each episode as short as possible. Hey, when I get to going, we don't know what it's going to lead to, but looking at my list right here, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things today, so it may or may not be long. So I had mentioned earlier that I wanted to tell you about a lesson that I was taught about legacy, and I said that's how I would like to begin this. And then depending on how long that part is, and where's my pen? Okay, because I'll mark things as I go along, and that way I'll know I've already talked about it. If it gets repeated later, if I repeat something that I've already said, I'll make sure that, I let you know I'm repeating this because it ties into this. Some things I might have to backtrack to go into whatever's next or whatever. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so the legacy lesson, that was the first lesson that I learned from him. But before I go into the legacy lesson, I need to continue where we left off, which was us, we meeting, okay? So, as you know, I did leave because I got the worm, and I talked with this niece and nephew again, found out that they were good friends with my uncle and his wife, my aunt, and, and then I went on to say what all happened after that. But anyway, we'll start back at that following Tuesday when I said I would visit him again. Oh yeah, I was there, Johnny on the spot, 1:00 p.m. Whenever I would visit him, I usually would try to stay consistent with the time. I would go earlier in the afternoon. He was an early riser, of course. He got up with the chickens. I didn't. But I didn't want to go there too late. And because, during that time, it was January and then into February, it was nice. It was like a nice summer day in Michigan. But for Oklahoma, that was cold. He was running the heat. My uncle was running the heat. It was just a nightmare with my sinuses at either place I went to because they thought it was cold. And then I get home and all the windows would be open because to me it was hot. But anyway, I got there. I went back that Tuesday, and his niece and nephew wasn't there that day. They always came. They came like maybe 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week. But if they had something else going on, like doctor's appointments for themselves, or sometimes they would go to Tulsa because they had children in Tulsa, that type of thing, then they didn't come. And so he was very independent. He still drove. He could walk, run. He liked to tinker in his shed. He used to, he was what they would call a junk artist. And one of the newspaper articles that I have talks about that. They did a story on him because he was a junk artist. So he would always say, God has a lot of nice things laying around. He took everything. He made a garbage basket, a waste basket out of egg cartons and fishing twine. I tried my best to make one. How he got that thing symmetrical, I'll never know, because I tried to do it and it just kept going straight. I tried to bend it. Every time I bend it, the egg carton would break. He made wind chimes. He would buy pipe, steel pipe from a store, and then he would cut the pipe in different lengths to give it a different sound. And then he took this big giant like lawnmower tire that's real heavy, and he would tie fishing line to that, make up the wind chime, and then he would use one of those plates. Remember when we were in elementary school, those mailmine type plates that we use? He would use the saucer, and that would be what would bang against the pipes. They made beautiful music. They were just loud, and they were very heavy. In fact, I have a pair. Mine fell apart. They melted in the sun, the fishing line, so I need to repair it. It's in my box, my artifacts box. And so it was no way I'll use them here because they are just too loud, okay? I did use them when I had moved back and was living at my mom's, and that's when they melted. I had them hanging right in the spot where the sun beamed on them all day long, and that's how that happened. One day I heard clunk, 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 and I looked out there, and there it was on the ground, okay? Anyway, so when I went back Tuesday, we just was talking and getting acquainted. I told him about myself and everything. And it was later I mentioned, and I'll just go on and tell this story now, and then we'll get to the lesson I learned, and then I'll end it. Okay, I had mentioned that that he said that he knew who I was before I came to Oklahoma. Okay, one thing he told me was, he said, when you turn 100, he said, you're not 100. He said, everybody I know now, he said, I don't know any other person that's 100 years old. He says, he said, most people don't believe me when I tell them this about when you turn 100. He said, the only way you would know is if you turn 100. And so he said, but most people don't believe me. He said, but I'm still going to tell you, Davis. I'm going to tell you what happens when you're 100. He proved to me that what he said was true. He proved it because he said to me, and he didn't know nothing about me. And like I said, his niece and nephew, yeah, they're friends. They were friends with my aunt and uncle and everything. But my uncle didn't tell anyone I was coming to Oklahoma. It wasn't like they saw each other on a daily basis. They basically knew each other from social settings. My aunt was in a bridge club, and I think that she, at one point, his wife, Miss Arletta, was in a bridge club, if I'm not mistaken. But it wasn't like they saw each other constantly. It's almost like they got a little closer and saw each other more after my connection, because I was connected to Mr. Andrews, and then, with me being my uncle's niece and everything, it seemed like they kind of got together more after that, because sometimes I would go over there. For instance, Mr. Andrews might ask me to take a package over there if he hadn't seen them, or if he knew he wasn't going to see them for a couple of days, or they may ask me to take something to him, that type of thing. So therefore, I was like the middle woman, in between, because they knew I was coming to my uncle's house, usually on the weekend. I didn't stay there the weekend, but I always made sure that I went to the house to visit, because I had cousins there and all that stuff. So I would come to my uncle's in Oklahoma City. So I was like the go-to person, the homing pigeon, so to speak, okay? Anyway, so it was like that. So they did not know about me before I got there. In fact, I met them, when I arrived, and and it wasn't until after I met Mr. Andrews and was leaving when he inquired about, he was like, well, I know you got in here some kind of way. Who's your kinfolk or whatever? And I said, my uncle is Dr. Worth Hatley. I didn't think he would, know who he was or whatever. I just told him. And he was like, Worth is your uncle? And that was all she wrote from there. So I know that when Mr. Andrews said what he said to me, I knew him to be truthful. And I said, there's no way he should have known this information, because he wasn't told it. I hadn't met him. I didn't know his niece and nephew and all that stuff. And Mr. Andrews didn't know my uncle either. Just the nephew did. But anyway, he says to me, he said, when you turn 100 years old, he said, things happen. He said, God will talk to you. He said, you hear people who are younger say, God spoke to me or whatever. He's like, but he really does speak to you. He said, he helps me. He said, I pay my own bills. Like I said, he was totally independent. Totally. And the only thing, he didn't cook, so his niece made sure she prepared his meals and things like that. And then I started in with some of that too, while, during the course of our friendship. But anyway, he said, God will tell you things. He said, you might dream it or he may reveal it to you. He said, Davis, I dreamt of you. He said, I dreamt that you moved to Oklahoma from somewhere up north. He didn't know what state I was from. I told him, after all that. He said, I dreamt of you. He said, and God told me this lady is going to come here and you're going to meet. And he said, did you lose your father? I was like, yeah, my father died on the 19th of January. Now, mind you, this is like maybe 3 weeks later at the most. I said, yeah, my father just died. I said, on the 19th of January, my first day of school. He said, that's what was revealed to me. He said, and I saw you just as good. He said, and I knew you were coming. He's like, but when you showed up, he said, I was just surprised because it happened so quickly. He said he had the dream like maybe a month prior. And I was there because I arrived there on the 1st of December. I'm all through Langston and whatnot, but I hadn't crossed his path. He lived, in one of the residential neighborhoods, although Langston is small, but I wasn't driving around or anything. And I was already there. So I might have already been there when he had the dream, or I may have come shortly thereafter. I guess God wanted to make sure I was coming, because remember, I was trying not to come and all that stuff. And so he probably said, okay, she's here. So let him know that she's coming. And so he started telling me things about myself, about he was telling me things about things that had happened in my life and all this stuff. I can't even remember what all it was, but he was. And I was like, how would you know this information? He said, because. He said, God told me. I was like, I believe you. I was like, because I didn't tell you and no one else, as far as I know, had told you other than God. So when he told me that, like I said, I knew from day one because of what I had prayed. And then for me to meet the centenarian, God already had everything aligned. I already knew it was spiritual. So I was like, okay, I'm going to just soak this up. Okay, I'm going to just roll with it and see what happens. So we got established like that. So I told him, I was like, okay, others may not believe you, because he was telling me other things. He said, I even told my preacher man that my wife comes to me. And he told me, you probably hallucinating or whatever. People will try to hem hard because it's either because they don't understand it, or they feel that it couldn't have happened, and that when someone reaches the age that he was, now he was so lucid, he was more lucid than what I am now. Like I said, he was spry, everything. He acted no older than maybe a 70-year-old man at the most. The only way you knew he was 100, and I don't know if any of you have ever met a centenarian, or even look at a picture, pull it up online, centenarians, people who have lived 100. Look in their eyes. Every one of them have the same look in their eyes. Their eyes become like a little sunken and they grow smaller. They all have a certain look. And I haven't met anyone 100 years old since then, but I've seen people on TV, who have reached that age, and every one of them have that same appearance. You can tell when someone has reached 100 years old, and he had that look. And anyway, and you don't get it until you reach that age. Before then, you're fine. It's like, but as soon as you hit that century mark, that's it. Your eyes are going to do that. And so, anyway, so I told him, I said, I believe you, I totally believe you. I said, because you just proved it to me. So I was like, so we could get that established now. I said, anything you tell me, I'm going to believe you and take it as a lesson or whatever. So whenever I would visit him, sometimes he would just bust out in a story. And I made it a point not to really question him or anything, not until the book deal came, and then that's when he told his life story and all that. But that was further down the pike. We met in January. The book deal came up like that following August or September. So it had been a while. We had known each other almost a year. And then, before he ended up dying, about 6, 7 months into the project. But anyway, I would just listen to him. I let him lead, the conversation. We did our hellos and how you doing today and it's hot outside and all that stuff. He would take me around, like he took me to his shed. He would show me all of his art projects. He had this beautiful tumbleweed that I just loved. He was like, I told you, God has a lot of nice things laying around. He was driving down the road because he still drove, even after 100. He drove up until the bitter end, basically. And he said, I saw a tumbleweed rolling across the highway. So I pulled the car over. He said, because the tumbleweed got caught and stopped. And I went and I got that tumbleweed. And he used silver spray paint for everything. This silver lead looking spray paint. It was real thick and silvery. And so he sprayed the tumbleweed. He cleaned it up and sprayed it. And he had it hanging in his den like a ornament or something. It was hanging from the ceiling like a flower. And so, and in fact, after he died, guess who inherited the tumbleweed? That's a long story, but believe me, that tumbleweed didn't last long. And it's a reason. I'll get into that later. But anyway, so, he would always, he would take me to tour his shed and he'll show me some art project. He showed me around his home. He had a 3-bedroom home. It wasn't big, but it wasn't small either. And so he told me all about his wife, and he was telling me about how his wife comes to him and different things. And I believed him when he said that. He said, she comes to me and tells me it's time for you to pay the phone bill or whatever. He said, now I'll pay it. He said, that's how I make it. People wonder, how do I pay my bills and all this? And I tell them, Lovey comes to me. And that's what he called her. I forgot her name. It's in my archives, but I can't remember her name quite. It's going to come to me, but right now I can't remember it. So he called her Lovey. That was the name he used for her. He told me about, them and their marriage, how they met and all that stuff. And they did have one daughter, but their daughter died in infancy. And then the wife could not have children after that. And the daughter's name was Zethel, Zethel, like Ethel. Her name, it had a Z in front of it, Zethel. And she was born in 1926. And she died that same year. I think she was maybe 7 or 8 months old, just died in infancy. He said, we walked in the room one day and I said, Lovey, she's still. He talked like that, And so I knew that he meant still as in she had passed away. And so he had a brother who his wife had a baby shortly thereafter, and she had a little girl. And in commemoration and honor of them, he named his daughter Zethel. And so this Zethel was still alive, and I met her and everything, the new Zethel, so to speak. And so she was almost like a daughter to Mr. Andrews. And she was actually the one after he died, I would have thought the niece and nephew would have been over everything. She was actually the one who was appointed, and she lived in another state. She was appointed over the estate and everything, but I'm jumping ahead. Okay, anyway, so let's go on to the lesson. So that's how that first visit kind of went. He talked about how he had seen me, before I even arrived to Oklahoma and all that. I came to him in a dream and all that stuff. And I'm hearing Twilight Zone music, the whole time. And then I told him, and I took my Having My Say book over there. I left. In fact, I gave him that copy because I bought so many copies of that book. I gave it to him and he just loved Bessie. So I was like, I want you to read this. I said, this is about 2 ladies who were 100 years old. They had made it, over 100 years old. I said, and I brought it to you because I said, number one, I said, one of the sisters, she had just died. Sadie Delaney, the oldest one, died in 1999. No, wait. No, yeah, she did. She died in 1999. So she didn't make it 3 centuries. But she was talking about if I live to the turn of the century, I will have lived in 3 different centuries, the 1800s, the 1900s, and the 2000s. I said, she didn't make it. I told him, I was like, she didn't make it. I said, she died in September. I think she died in like September of 99 or somewhere around there. I have to look at her death date. It might have been August. Bessie died first, the younger one. She died first in 1995. Anyway, I said, but Mr. Andrews, I said, you made it. I said, you were born in 1890. He's like, I tell people all the time, I lived in 3 different centuries. He said, I don't remember the 1800s. He said, but I was born in 1899, and he was born in March of 1899. So it was only 3 months in when he came along. So he lived almost that whole full year of the 1800s or the 19th century. And then he lived through all of the 19th century, the 20th century, and then he made it into the 21st. And he lived until 2001. So he made it a whole year into the next century. And he knew just as big that he had lived in 3 centuries. So, and I was like, this is something for me. To me, somebody who has lived in 3 centuries, it was just mind-boggling to me. For that prayer to be answered. So basically, I told him, about the prayer. And I told him, this is what changed my life. I said, I am here because of this book right here. I said, so I want you to read it. And he read it. He read every word. We discussed the book and everything. And then I told him, and then I'm here because of you. I said, because when I prayed, I asked God to let me come to college. I said, and I also asked him to let me meet somebody who had lived to be 100. I said, and God chose you. I was like, and he chose me for this. I was like, so we're going to make the best of this. And boy, did we have some fun during our journey. Okay, so to the lesson. One day I went over to visit him, and he just started kind of talking. He said, when you get forgiven by God, and he just out the blue just said that. He said, when God forgives you, he said, forgiveness starts the moment that you feel remorse. So he said, if it's something bad that you've done, of course, my soul's stirring. I'm thinking, okay, what have I done here? He might know, And so he was like, if you've done something bad and it's bothering you and it's on your conscience, he said, that's when forgiveness begins. He said, you can ask for forgiveness, he said, but if you're not sincere and you don't feel that remorse for whatever it is you've done, he said, you're just asking for forgiveness just because you know that's what you're supposed to do. He said, but if you truly feel remorse for it in your heart, he said, you don't even have to ask. He said, because the forgiveness has already begun and you know not to do that thing again. And so I thought about, bad things I've done in my life. Oh yeah, everybody has done something, that they're not proud of. And so that was one lesson, and he added that lesson in with the next one. So then he started talking about, he never really talked about race relations or anything. He did mention something to me, and I'll get to that later in another chapter. He mentioned about how he felt racism would end. Okay, but in this one, the subject of race didn't really come up until this incident happened. And it was a lesson of a lifetime. I'll never forget it. And I think it's the most valuable lesson I ever learned. And it's about legacy. He talked about how he wanted his legacy. He said, I would like to be remembered, after I die. He said, I hope people remember me. He said, because after so long, he said, people may not remember you. He said, so I would like to be remembered, and I said, that's something I would like too. I said, I would like to be remembered once I leave. I was like, but how long will it last? I said, memories fade, people die off. And then all of a sudden he said, and that's exactly the story I'm about to tell you. I'm like, well, okay, well, come on with it. What's the story? I had no idea what he was going to say. He said, a couple of years ago, he said, this young white guy knocked on the door. And he said, I looked and I said, may I help you? He said, I didn't know him. He was a younger guy, maybe in his 20s or early 30s. And he said, I was in Guthrie, which was the next town over. He said, and he was from another state, and he was doing his family tree. And so his grandfather was from the town of Guthrie, which was the next town over. We were in Langston. Then you had Coyle, Perkins, Stillwater, all these different little towns within a few miles of each other. He said, and when I stopped in Guthrie, my grandfather's old town, actually it was his great-grand, it was either his great-grand, no, it was his great-great-grand, if I'm not mistaken. It was way down the line, because he was doing this family tree. And he said, I never met him. And he said, my parents don't remember him. No one in their family remembered him. They knew of him. They knew who he was. But when he went to Guthrie to try to do some research on his, we're going to just say great-great-grandfather. It might even have been his great-great-great. All them years. When he tried to do some research, he found very little information. And this man was a doctor. He was the local doctor, the town's doctor, because you only had one back in those days. And so in the early 1900s. So he said that someone in Guthrie told him, there's a man in Langston, he's 100 years old, and he might have known your grandfather or your we'll just say grandfather. I keep all that stuff. Let me just say grandfather, but we know it was some greats down the line. He said, he may have known your grandfather. And he told him he said, his name is Henry Andrews. He lives in Langston. All you need to do is go and ask where he lives, and someone will direct you to him. And you can go and ask him if he knew your grandfather. He can tell you anything you want to know. And before I finish the story, let me mention to you. Now, I never met my grandmother. I told y'all about all that. Everything I knew about my grandmother is what I was told by my mother. This was her mother. And my uncles, they told me things about her. Everybody had a different story. And I gathered up the same thing. Everybody said that she was feisty and, and things like that. Well, when we went to Oklahoma in 1999, when I visited the college and stuff, we went to Sapulpa, which is where my mother and her family were from. And when we were there, we visited my mother's and uncle's childhood friends. And they were Native American. Or, yeah, they were, because their mother was Native American. Anyway, we went over there. They had this big barbecue in our honor and stuff. We went to the cemetery, saw my grandparents' graves. Well, their mother was still alive, and their mother was my grandmother's best friend. And I was like, oh, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. And she was in her high 80s, somewhere around there. But Miss Gibbs, she was very, she was with it. And she was very beautiful. She had this beautiful straight wavy hair. All of them, do, when they're part Native American. And so she was just real nice. So we were sitting there. It was so hot outside and the mosquitoes was tearing me up and everybody outside getting bit up. It had gotten dusk. And I went on in the house, and Miss Gibbs was in the house. And so I sat down. I said, you mind if I sit down? And she was like, no, not at all. And so we sitting in the living room, and we're just kind of talking. And I said, I understand you were my grandmother's best friend. I was like, I didn't meet my grandmother and all this. I said, and everything I knew about her, I said, my mother told me. And my uncles, they told me about her and stuff. I was like, as her best friend, what could you tell me about my grandmother from a friend perspective? And she told me, she said, she was my best friend. She said, we were so busy. She's like, she said, I had a lot of kids. And, she said, and your grandmother, she said, Minnie, because that was her name. She said, Minnie had your mother and the two brothers. The other brother, who was 20 years older than my mother, he had already moved, he was on his own and stuff and married and everything else. He had children older than my mother. And so anyway, she said, we were always so busy during the week, we could never visit. They lived maybe 5 doors down. They were on the same dirt road and everything. But they didn't see each other unless it was maybe in passing. She said the only time we could visit was on Sunday because we all went to the same church, which was right up the hill. Mama took me to the church, and I'm like, this is it. But anyway, they went to the same church. She said, so she said Minnie would always come here so that we could walk to church together. She said, so she would come and I would have the coffee ready and we would sit down for about 30 minutes every Sunday to visit and have a cup of coffee. She said, and after our cup of coffee, we would leave to get to the 11 o'clock service at church. She said, and then we would always walk home from church together, and we didn't see each other unless it was in passing or just waving until that next Sunday. She said, I looked forward every week. She said, we both always looked forward to our Sunday visit. And I thought, wow, that was just so small, but how powerful. Wow. Think about that. You know, you have a friend and we see our friends. We're on the phone with them every day and online with them, and we take that stuff for granted. They did not take it for granted. That was the one day of the week, 30 minutes out of a whole week where they got to spend time as friends, catch up on things, talk, have a cup of coffee. And she smoked a pipe. And I think Mama said her mother dipped snuff. Everybody smoked and did tobacco back then, you know, because they grew it and all that. But that was the only time that they had, you know, to do that, to socialize. And she said, I really looked forward to that, and that's what kept me going. She was like, I don't know about Minnie. I know she looked forward to it because we enjoyed it. She said, but she said, as far as I'm concerned, that's what kept me going. And she said when Minnie died, because my grandmother died young, she was 60 years old. She had just made 60, and, you know, she had a bad heart, and she, you know, she died of heart failure at the age of 60. The age I am now, I'm like, wow. And she's like, I was hurt when Minnie died. She said, because that was my friend. And she said, after that, she said, I had other friends who I, you know, from church and stuff, but she was my best friend, and we were neighbors. And she said it was very hurtful when she passed away. Okay, so now I done went off this story, but it ties in. So this young man, back to Mr. Andrews, this young man came to Langston. He found out where Mr. Andrews lived. He came, knocked on his door, and Mr. Andrews came to the door and said, may I help you? And the man explained who he was. Mr. Andrews told me, he told me his name, and he explained who he was. He said, I'm from whatever state. I think it was somewhere in the South, Louisiana somewhere. And he said, but my grandfather grew up in Guthrie, and he was a doctor in Guthrie. He said, and I'm trying to get information on him for our family tree. And someone told me to come see you because you are 100 years old and would know about him. And Mr. Andrews said, he looked at him and said, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. He said, but do you know who he was? He said, I know exactly who he was. He said, but I can't help you. And he said, well, why can't you help me? If you knew who he was, obviously you know, knew something about him. He said, no. He said, back then, he said, we could not go to the doctors in Guthrie. We had to go to the black doctor. It was segregated. He says, so we never got to know him or know anything about him. We just knew that he was the white doctor, and we had to go to the black doctor. We weren't even allowed to go into his office or anything. And he said, the man hung his head, and he said, thank you, sir. And he walked off. And so Mr. Andrews looked at me. He said, I felt bad for the young fella. He said, because had I been allowed, or if anyone from this town back then had been allowed to go to the doctor's office that was segregated, he said, I would have been able probably to tell him anything he wanted to know about his father. I could have said he was a kind man, or what type of doctor he was, or anything. He said, but I couldn't tell him. He said, so he had to leave, you know, empty-handed. And he said, but I felt bad, he said, because he said, to this day, I am the only person on this earth who knew who that man was. He said, this man is long gone. Everybody who knew him or was associated with him, other than his family, who didn't even get to meet him because he died before they were born, he said, I'm the only one alive, still alive, who knew anything about that man when he was alive. And he said, had I been allowed to at least set foot into the doctor's office, I would have been able to tell him what he needed to know. And he could have filled in the blanks to his family history. And that taught me right then and there. Whew, I was like, oh my goodness. You never know who may live long enough to remember you once you're gone. So it's important to treat people kindly. That taught me a lesson that I'll never forget. And I hope I explained it well to you, because that's one that I want to really put out there. And from then on, that kind of changed me. I thought about it. I was like, I'm not a mean person. Never have been. Never have been. But I became more conscious after that to not be mean and not to do anything that to knowingly hurt someone or whatever, because you never know who one person may live that I've crossed paths with, even a baby now. I can cross paths with them and they might live to be 100 years old and I'll be long gone. And that person, I may have done something or said something kind to them, and they remember me and say, this lady, she died back in whatever year. And it's been over 70, 80 years since she died. But I can tell you about her. One of my family members might come up, tell me about her. Tell me about Q. I be seeing her online and stuff. You knew her personally. What can you tell me about her? What do you remember? So I want to be remembered as being nice and she was a friend to all or whatever. That's what I want to be said. You know, I don't want someone to say I can't help you because she didn't welcome me into her home or she did not treat me well or whatever. So that's the lesson. Okay, where are we? Let's see. We are at, and I feel like I just rambled because I'm tired. Okay, 37 minutes. We did good for episode 1. Okay, so we're going to end this here. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk about, you know what, this might not be real long because I'm going to be adding, because I talked about a couple of things here. Hold on. Lesson about legacy. Okay, that's done. Wasn't allowed at the doctor's office. Okay, God has a lot of nice things. That's 2 things. Aging after 100. That's 3 things. Okay, so we're getting on down the list. Okay, so, what would end racism? We'll talk about that next. And then, we talked about the wife comes when he needs to pay the bills, okay. And the daughter, okay. Oh, we're going to talk about how he and his wife met. Okay, so I put an asterisk there. Okay, so, on the next one, we're going to talk about how he and his wife met and what he said would end racism. It was interesting, okay? Very interesting. Okay. Oh, he dreamed about me. I wrote that down. Okay, we getting there, y'all. See how much we get through today. So we'll be back on, I guess, Sunday to go into the next part. So let me see. I put the asterisk right next to everything I'm going to talk about next week. So we'll try to keep it like at 30 minutes. So we'll probably wrap this up after probably 3 episodes. But I hope you enjoy this. Let me know what you think. I hope I didn't come off as rambly because I sound like I was rambling. So I'll try to be more rested the next time, and I'll try to write down what I'm going to say instead of talking off of the top of my head, because it's like you remember things as you talk and whatnot. So we'll see how it all goes. All right, so I'm getting ready to get up from here. I'm going to go to bed. I got a couple of more YouTube videos to watch, but hey, I can do that in bed, huh? So, and the slop. I might change this picture. I'll see what the thumbnail picture is. If you see food in the thumbnail picture, it's the slop. Y'all. Only thing is, I got the potatoes a little bit too done. They were a little bit too soft. But, oh man, it was good. Let me tell you what I put in it, in case you ever want to make some slop. Okay, I put yellow bell pepper. I sliced that. In it, I put some fresh grown basil, because I harvested that today, some of it, and I hung it up to dry, but I took a few sprigs to add to the slop. Onion, garlic, shallots. I put some French tarragon in it, okay, and all that was for flavor, and I used Italian seasoning. I did not add the salt and pepper, and it was seasoned perfectly. I used the potatoes. I put some kohlrabi in it. I put a handful of okra in it, and okay, I said the potatoes. Oh, and I put smoked sausage in it. I layered it, and I'm gonna show it to you so you'll see how it looked in the skillet. And so, and then I turned it on low, and I cooked it low and slow. I let it just simmer and soften. And once it was done, it was perfect. But I left it on the hot eye. I should have taken the skillet off of the eye and put it to the side because it continued to cook. Even once I turned off because I have an electric stove, so it takes a while for it to cool down. And then that's how the potatoes got too soft. But it's still good. It was delicious, you guys. Okay, so anyway, so that's how I made my slop. If I'm still full, and I ate hours ago, okay? So I can't wait to eat it some more tomorrow because there was quite a bit left over. When those seasonings settle in, tomorrow's going to be even better. Okay, you guys, so I'm going to get off of here, and I will talk to you in the next one, and may God bless you all. You may not see me until Sunday unless something happens or whatever. Hey, the spirit might hit me. I might decide to come in with another story or whatever with the saga and everything. If I do that, then maybe we can wrap up Sunday, but I don't know. Y'all let me know. Do y'all want me to do another one on Friday? And if so, we can do that one, and then hopefully I can try to wrap it up on Sunday. Wait a minute. I said that real slow because I was thinking, okay, it's going to be some stories here that are going to be longer than others, especially with the death. That one's going to be probably an hour long telling all that. Okay, I'm still talking. Shut up, Q. Okay, I will talk to you guys later. May God bless you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye. This will get posted when I'm up, okay? It might be late, it might be early. Just look for it. Okay, bye-bye.